Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm David Clement, guest hosting for Tanya Granick-Allen. If you have kids, your back-to-school shopping is likely complete because kids of all ages have officially returned to school in what feels like the first post-COVID return to school. But have all students across all levels returned back to the classroom without pandemic restrictions? Are there looming threats of additional COVID waves come winter that could or should close schools again? And most importantly, do we have a full understanding of the negative consequences of closing schools? How hard is the adjustment going to be? And just how far behind have students fallen? Joining me to discuss this is Dr. Scott Masson and Professor Mark Mercer. Thank you both for joining me on Counterpoint.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
So right off the bat, what's the landscape across the country for students returning to school? How close to normal are we getting?
Well, what I understand from people I've spoken to, it varies university to university and region to region. At the university I teach at, masks are required, but no longer does one have to show proof of vaccination. Masks are required for students, not for teachers if there's a distance between the front row and where the teacher is. But other schools, I'm told, have no restrictions at all. And as you know, Western was attempting, I don't know what's happened, but Western was attempting to require the vaccination, proof of vaccination. So university to university across the country, different regulations are in place.
And Dr. Masson, how do the decision makers here reconcile the disparity between universities and the rest of society? Because in many instances, a student can go to a sporting event that's sold out with 20,000 people, no proof of vaccination, no mask required. And yet when they want to do in-person learning at a post-secondary institution, they have to wear a mask, or in some more severe instances, like the one mentioned by Mr. Mercer, they may still be required to provide proof of vaccination. How does one justify that disparity?
Well, you're going to find it difficult to get an answer there because, of course, the administrators are only going to answer for what they're responsible for. And the divergences between the institutions, which is obvious to everybody, is going to be one of the things that causes the rest of us to consider the rationale for making their decisions entirely arbitrary. And this is the problem with the narrative of that we're following the science now, is that the science seems to vary with each school and with every institution. And there are certain patterns there, but there is no longer uniformity. It no longer seems to follow science. It's just everyone can do what seems right in their eyes. And yet the restrictions are obvious restrictions on personal liberties and freedoms on everyone, and seem to be justified in accordance with that, yet without threat or any public health declarations that they have to. So it's sort of the threat of mandate looming in the background without actually having one. And it's disturbing that it is particularly in educational institutions. I'm sure Mark will agree with that on that.
Yeah, and Mark, do you see maybe an appetite, or I'm forecasting a little bit, an appetite if numbers do go up in the winter, which some are expecting, that some of these university administrations will want to double down on maybe previous restrictions that they've peeled back since?
Well, it really depends. It depends on from whom the administrators are taking advice and orders. Quite often it's faculty unions that are insisting that restrictions be in place. The administrators might not care to put any more firm restrictions in place, but the faculty unions ask for them for one reason or another. I mean, this is why we see differences university to university. There are different systems of decision making and different concerns from the various people involved in decision making. Some groups are very afraid, and other groups are not so afraid. I would hope that the universities were looking to science and evaluating results as best they can. But that seems not to be it. It seems to be more who can apply the most pressure is the group that gets what they want. But to your question, I'm like Scott, very much afraid of more restrictions.
I do just have to quickly interrupt you to go to break, but I'll let you continue that thought when we return. And we're back on Counterpoint. Mark, just prior to the break, you were mentioning the fear of kind of caving into those interests and maybe the return of some of those additional restrictions. Why is it that you're fearful? Is it academic stunting? Is it limitations in terms of that professor or student experience? What is it that bothers you about that potential return to some of those restrictions?
The student-professor experience, the interaction, the classroom, the meeting in offices, meeting people in the hallways or cafeterias and talking to them. When we were forced to do Zoom meetings or team meetings with students with the class, that I found it very difficult. It was. I don't think it was a good experience for the students. I don't think they learned much, and they certainly weren't able to enjoy or be enthusiastic about learning. So this is what I'm concerned about, that we'll go back to remote teaching, and I'd really very much not want to.
And Dr. Masson, on the remote side of things, have you found any limitations in terms of academic performance? Has this set students back? I know that a lot of students rightfully complained that they were paying the same tuition for virtual university for so long, but has that created a lag maybe in academic performance?
It's difficult to say at the moment because we're just coming out of it. I do think that those that began their university experience online have been significantly harmed in various ways because university is more than sitting and looking at somebody across a screen. I mean, I've put my lectures up on YouTube. I have told, however, that many professors were not exactly competent or efficient or even dedicated to teaching that way. And it's even worse in the schools, where I think the biggest harms have been caused. The younger the child, the worse it was, I think, in terms of personal interaction and so forth. That probably just stands to reason for most people. I share Mark's concerns about this coming back because, again, the COVID is endemic now. There's no rationale for it to be continuing, the mandates and the regime of mandates to persist, and yet we're not out of that. And there's a sense that signals are being given at various levels that we may have to do this again if the next wave, et cetera, et cetera. And the if in most people's minds becomes a when, not an if. And so we have good reason based on past experience to think that there's no reason why we won't go back to this so long as our masters have not said we're back to normal. And I would like to see that politically myself.
And what would you say to, let's say, a critic of that position who says, well, masks will aid in some way in terms of shifting or decreasing transmission rates. It's worth it. It's worth whatever the costs are. Do you think that argument for either of you has any merit?
No.
I might be a bit more generous. I would want that argument to be made publicly, to be discussed critically, and then voted on by competent people, union administration. And in that sense, if masks is the will of the people after critical debate, then even if it's the wrong decision, at least it's been made fairly. And one can live with it or at least challenge it. But what we're getting, I think, is just the results of pressure groups, and not anything like critical discussion, anything like a open and free debate and
right. And but Mark, that's just the masks. There are other mandates as well, from being vaxxed to boosted, and those are related to the Nuremberg Code, and so those things are not just a lack of free speech. Those are violations of basic ethics, and we haven't really seen any public discussion of that.
I agree with you entirely, Scott. I think that's right. There are those things that we can't vote on and change. Civil liberties and rights are among them. That's right. I was speaking, just about masks and maybe about putting classes online again. If that's to be done, and I don't think from what I understand, there's no good reason to do it. But if that is to be done, it should be done after critical discussion and through proper channels.
Yeah, certainly transparency in any of these decisions, regardless of where they go, would be appreciated. Thank you both for joining me today on Counterpoint. Now joining me is journalist Andrew Lawton. Andrew, thank you for joining me on Counterpoint. Our previous guests alluded to some developments at Western University in London. Explain to viewers what the university administration is attempting to do in terms of vaccine mandates for students and staff.
Well, I mean, they're doing something that no other school in Canada, so far as I can tell, is doing, which is requiring 3 doses to be a student on campus, be a faculty member on campus, or even visit the campus, with the exception of a few little carve-outs they've done. One of which, curiously, was if you're a donor. If you're a donor, you can visit the campus without needing 3 vaccinations. But the one thing that was interesting, originally they were going to put this in place in October. Now, they've since backed up a little bit and said that the vaccine mandate for 3 doses will go into effect in January. So their argument is that they're giving people more time to go through it. Now, it's possible that what they're actually doing here is letting it die on the order paper, so to speak. So they bump it back, and then by the time January comes around, they say, well, the situation has changed and it's no longer necessary. But effectively right now, if you're a student that needs to go to school and be on campus until the end of the year, you will not be able to do that, as the current policy lays out, unless you have 3 vaccinations.
And how does the administration justify this? I mean, if we look at the rest of society, if you're a student, you have 2 doses or no doses for that matter. You could go to a London Knights game, 12,000 people, sold out crowd, no masks, no vaccine certificate checks or anything like that. You go to a bar or a club, in close contact with people, talking, all of that. How does the university justify the disparity? Because obviously students' behavior outside of the university doesn't align necessarily with this level of scrutiny or this level or severity of COVID policy.
No, and I mean, even last year, when most universities, including Western, had a mask mandate and social distancing in the classrooms in many cases. Western didn't do classroom social distancing, as I recall. It didn't really matter, because once they get outside of the school and are having parties at houses, students are ripping off their masks. They're maybe inviting their unvaccinated friends. And we know that the 2-dose vaccine that most Canadians got did not stop the Omicron wave. It did not stop the winter case surge. But we do know that COVID has gotten more and more mild. So the argument that vaccination is required to reduce transmission just hasn't actually been supported by the data. So what Western's really doing here is saying that the only way they can be confident about keeping the ability to keep classes in line is by this mandate. But it actually isn't clear how they're getting from that policy to that conclusion, to that policy objective.
It almost feels like the administration may be stuck in October 2021 in terms of the data that we had on 2 doses and the way in which the pandemic was unfolding at the time. Do you feel like maybe there's a lag in regards to evaluating the evidence? Certainly, I mean, I'm vaccinated happily. I know many people who are. It certainly reduces your risk of some of the more severe side effects or illness related to COVID-19. But in some senses, this just feels like it's stuck in the past and they've failed to adapt as the pandemic has changed, because it's changed so much. Do you think that's a fair take?
It is. And I mean, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the federal government's handling of this, but I will say that even the federal government has argued that the 2-dose vaccine passport really didn't do anything in the context of where we are now, which is why they suspended it for air travel, why they suspended it for the public sector. So I do think there's an argument to say that the 2-dose vaccine mandate is not going to do anything. And I think the challenge is that Western is really improvising by saying that, okay, maybe the third one will. And when you talk about the bump back that they did to January, one of their reasons was, well, we know that Health Canada has just approved this new bivalent vaccine, which targets the Omicron strain. So we'll hold back, and then people can get that one when it comes out. But even so, they're not mandating that one specifically. So I think it's really trying to find a way to justify a policy that they probably thought more schools would follow and didn't. And I think when Western ended up standing alone here, and even one of the affiliated campuses on Western, Brescia College, said, no, we're not doing a vaccine mandate. I really think that caused a lot of that reevaluation to take place.
Yeah, I mean, the disparities within an educational institution, you mentioned donors. That's one we'll get to after the break, because that one strikes me as a real head scratcher. We'll talk more about this when we come back from commercial in just a moment. And we're back on Counterpoint. I am joined by Andrew Lawton. Andrew, you mentioned that there were some rather cheesy exemptions to Western's 3-dose vaccine mandate. One of them being donors. So correct me if I'm wrong. If you are a donor or prospective donor, you don't have to abide by this potential 3-dose mandate. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I made a little bit of a joke at the rally that a group of concerned students held, where I pulled, I think it was like a $5 bill out of my pocket. So I'm not exactly the big spender as far as prospective donors go. And I held it up and I said, I'm thinking about giving this to Western. So that makes me a prospective donor. And there are others as well, like, the Uber driver that picks you up or drops you off from campus is not going to have to be vaccinated. Fine. The food delivery driver is not going to have to be vaccinated. That's fine. But, when you look at a visiting athletic team, someone that will spend some time on campus, they don't need to be vaccinated. But if you're going to your child's convocation, you do. So there are all of these different exemptions, and the exceptions rule of what defines a visitor is actually several pages long, which I think reinforces that we're making values judgments here, and we're making judgment calls. We're not actually doing anything here that is rooted in science, because if the science is that it is unsafe for someone who's not triple vaccinated to be on campus, that should apply to anyone that's going to step foot in a school building.
Yeah, I mean, the virus doesn't care whether you're a donor or not. There's no way for the virus itself, I'm speaking as if it's a person, but there's no way for the virus to differentiate between someone's interest in donating to an institution. How many students do you think are going to be impacted by this? Because I know that for younger people, the 2-dose vaccine uptake was relatively good from a more equals better perspective. But has that translated for 3 doses? Are there young people who are actually actively going out and getting that 3rd dose?
Short answer is no. I mean, we know, looking at the province-wide numbers, that 3-dose uptake was about 33%, I think, for the age demographic 18 to 29. And it was even lower when you go 12 to 17. And obviously the lower end of the 18 to 29 is going to be a bit lower, and the higher end of the 12 to 17. So those are the demographics we got. But we do know that we're saying probably a third, maybe on the high end, 40% are vaccinated. So you're dealing with 60% of the student population that is going to decide whether to go along with it or not. And many of them are not against it. They just never got around to it because they didn't need to, and now they need to for this mandate. And I still think that's a significant problem. But then there's the other part of this, which is whether a 3-dose one will be enough, because the government federally has changed its language on this to being up to date. And they define up to date as within the last 6 months. Well, if you got a booster when they first became available in January, February, you are no longer, by the federal government's standards, up to date. And when you look at fourth doses, the number just goes down to like a fraction, especially for younger groups. So I think that's a big challenge here, and that, you know, a lot of people will get it because they have to, but that's not exactly a choice. And some of the organizers have said that, you know, it is still coercive if you go along with it only because there's a mandate.
We have about a minute to go here. How would Western as an institution adjust if they had, let's say, 20%, 30% of their students not able to attend in-person learning? Are they splitting class between online and virtual? Are they unenrolling students and offering refunds? Logistically, this seems like it could be a potential nightmare.
It is. And I should say, I mean, online students are exempt from the mandate, except if they have any in-person component. And a lot of online classes have an in-person exam at the end of the year. So if you're a student, even that option wouldn't be enough. So Western could fix the policy a little bit by saying, well, we'll allow anyone who's on any in-class course can be done online. But that doesn't really solve the problem here if they have just this huge portion of their student population that isn't allowed to step foot on campus. I think what's likely to happen is they're going to kick that thing back to January as they've done. And I think when they come back from the winter and they see those numbers aren't there, they'll have to say, the situation has changed, we no longer need it, because I don't think they want to admit that they got it wrong.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Andrew. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, it looks like there's still a lot of debate on university campuses across Canada in regards to what restrictions could or should be. Time will tell and see how this plays out, but there's certainly a lot of cognitive dissonance going around. Thank you for joining me on Counterpoint.